source of prosecutions, with the prohibition of first alcohol and then other substances. American drug arrests climbed 12-fold from 1965 to the end of the century. These are, however, crimes we inflict on ourselves. They are acts that society has decided to consider and treat as penal transgressions, but that could equally well have been dealt with by other means, or not at all. Smuggling was widespread in 18th century England because high tariffs, imposed by a state with few other sources of tax revenue, made it a lucrative enterprise. And it was hard to combat because smugglers were popular, offering the average person cut-rate goods. When England made primary schooling compulsory in 1870, almost 100,000 parents of truants were hauled before courts in the law's first year. Had crime really increased, or had it merely been redefined upwards? To lament today that criminality is skyrocketing because prisons are crammed with pushers and users says less about our narcotics problem than about how we have dealt with it. It is rather like worrying that Armageddon must be nigh because the executioner is busy hanging more infidels and apostates than ever. For other offenses, ones that are indisputably the sort intended for the penal code, reliable statistical answers are hard to come by. Definitions of crime have varied, as has victims' willingness to report. Not every transgression exists objectively out there as an evident offense, even though all crimes are obviously defined in and by the penal code. Novel technologies have created new crimes where once there were none. Phishing, say. The most commonly committed crime today is the robocall, 180 million daily in the U.S., half of all phone calls. Awash, as we are in a cornucopia of pilferable objects, little wonder that theft is up. Yet stealing an unguarded cell phone in a metropolitan bus terminal is a different act than larceny of a firearm or other prized singular possession from a home in a 17th century village, especially considering how buffered we are from the consequences of theft by our hypertrophied insurance industry. Whether victims of rapes are willing to report them, and whether such violations are legally actionable have varied dramatically. Acts once illegal, adultery, are no longer, whereas formerly tolerated behaviors, spousal abuse, have become prosecutable. Whether such shape-shifting offenses have increased or diminished is hard to track. Homicide, indisputable and hard to conceal, is therefore the most studied crime. Here we see a dramatic decline. In Europe, where the data over long periods are available, killings plummeted from 100 per 100,000 inhabitants in the Middle Ages to 1 per 100,000 by the early 20th century. This bears restating. Over the past 5 centuries, average rates of homicide have declined 100-fold. Today's English are 1% as likely to be killed as Chaucer's contemporaries. During the early period of frontier violence, the American colonies of the Northeast had rates as bad as those in medieval Europe, which then declined starting in the early 17th century. In the mid-18th and again in the early 19th century, U.S. homicide rates were comparable to the rest of the Western world. In the 19th century, they then rose again. The slave-holding South and the frontier West suffered much higher levels, though the West was long so sparsely populated that its statistics may be misleading. This happy decline of killings holds over the long run. But in the long term, as Cain's famously lamented, we are all dead. Political debates are not framed against centuries-long secular oscillations, but against what happened last year. Crime, and then imprisonment, did rise during the final decades of the 20th century as a blip on these larger and longer downward trends. Such temporary reversals of the overall decline have occurred before, for example in Sweden between the 1790s and the 1840s, and in England from the 1580s to the 1610s. The larger trend eventually reasserted itself, as it has again today in the United States. By the early 1990s, crime rates had leveled off and once again began to decline. In the United States, the numbers not only